It was a gray, overcast Monday morning when Gustavo stepped through the tall iron gates of his new school, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a jacket that was slightly too big for him, his backpack slung lazily over one shoulder. The building loomed in front of him like a fortress, made of cold bricks and narrow windows that seemed to watch him as he moved. He took a deep breath, trying to steady the anxious tremble in his chest. 14 was already a complicated age, and now, being the new kid at a school where he didn't know a soul, only made things worse. His mother had kissed him on the cheek that morning and whispered, "Be strong, baby. Just be yourself. They'll see how wonderful you are." And he had nodded, even though he wasn't sure if she really believed it herself. The hallways buzzed with chatter as he entered the main doors, students milling around lockers and classrooms, most too preoccupied with their own lives to pay him any attention. A few heads turned, but he kept his gaze low and followed the signs to room 207, his homeroom, his first class of the day. He walked in cautiously, the classroom already half full, students chatting in clusters or scrolling through their phones. Gustavo looked around, uncertain of where to sit. There was an empty desk near the middle row, so he made his way to it, sliding into the seat and placing his bag on the floor. For a moment, everything was still. Then the bell rang. The door burst open, and in strode the teacher, a tall woman with sharp eyes and neatly pinned-up hair, her heels clicking against the tiled floor like gunshots. Her name, he would later learn, was Mrs. Carmichael. She placed a stack of papers on her desk and turned to face the class, her gaze scanning the room with practiced authority until it landed on him. Her face stiffened, and her lips pressed into a tight, almost imperceptible frown. Gustavo looked up, unsure why she was staring. "You," she said suddenly, pointing at him. "What are you doing here?" The class fell silent, all eyes turning to Gustavo. His stomach dropped. I'm in this class," he said hesitantly. "My name is Gustavo. I just transferred." Mrs. Carmichael narrowed her eyes. "That's not what I asked. I asked what you're doing here, in this room, in that seat. You don't belong there." Confused, Gustavo blinked. "But this is room 207, right? This is my schedule." He pulled the crumpled paper from his pocket and held it up. "Homeroom with Mrs. Carmichael." She walked toward him, her movements stiff, her expression unreadable. The other students looked around at each other, unsure of what was happening. "No," she said flatly. "No, you don't get to just come in here and sit wherever you want. This is a structured environment, not a street corner." Her voice was loud, sharp, and judgmental, and Gustavo felt a heat rising in his face, not from guilt, but from embarrassment. "I didn't do anything," he murmured. "I just sat down." "Don't talk back to me," she snapped. "Get up, get your things, and get out of my classroom." Now, the room was dead silent, the atmosphere thick with tension. Gustavo looked around, hoping someone, anyone, might speak up. But no one did. They just stared. "Why?" he asked softly, voice trembling. "What did I do wrong?" She folded her arms, her voice now dripping with contempt. "You really don't get it, do you?" she said. "You don't fit in here, and I don't have time to babysit someone like you. So go, find another classroom. Or go home. I don't care." His heart pounded in his chest, a strange mixture of confusion and shame washing over him. "You're kicking me out?" he asked, almost in disbelief. "Why?" "Because I'm black." Her lips twitched, not quite forming a smirk, but close. "If the shoe fits," she muttered under her breath. The words hit him like a slap. He froze, staring at her. She didn't say anything else, just gestured toward the door. "Leave." Gustavo slowly stood, the scrape of his chair against the floor sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. He picked up his bag, his hands shaking. He turned to the door, but before stepping through it, he looked back at her. She had already turned away, as if he no longer existed. The students watched, wide-eyed and silent, some of them whispering behind their hands. Gustavo walked out into the hallway, his throat tight, his eyes burning. He didn't cry. Not yet. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction. But deep inside him, something cracked, not just from the humiliation, but from the realization that this might not be the last time he'd be treated like this. He wandered down the hallway, not sure where to go, the weight of the morning already pressing heavy on his shoulders. Gustavo stood frozen in the doorway, his backpack dangling from his hand, his breath caught somewhere between disbelief and panic, and after a second that stretched like eternity, he turned back into the room, his voice shaky but louder than before, trying to make sense of what was happening to him, trying to find the right words to ask the one question burning inside him. Why are you doing this to me? The silence in the room thickened, and all the students stared at him with wide eyes, some with curiosity, some with discomfort, some with that blank look of people witnessing something wrong, but too afraid or unsure to step in. And the teacher, Mrs. Carmichael, turned slowly toward him, her expression still hard, still cold, as though nothing in the world could shift the steel in her voice or the disgust in her eyes. And she said, "Because you don't belong here," her words slicing the air like glass. And Gustavo swallowed, still standing in the doorway, his fingers trembling against the fabric of his backpack strap, and he asked again, his voice smaller now, cracked, "What did I do to you?" And she looked at him, her eyes narrowing, her lips curling into something bitter, and then she said it, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Because you're black. That's why. Now get out. You heard me. Leave. Go back to wherever you came from, and don't step into my classroom again." Her words rang in the air like a bell tolling the end of something sacred, and a few students gasped, others whispered. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but none of them moved or said anything, and Gustavo felt his heart drop into some cold, dark place inside his chest, a place he didn't know existed until now, and without saying another word, he turned away and walked down the hall, each step heavier than the last, the sound of her voice echoing in his head. "Because you're black," over and over, like a cruel mantra, and he walked without direction, unsure where he was going, unsure what he would do next, his feet carrying him away from the classroom, from the stairs, from the pain that was quickly morphing into a numbness that scared him more than anything. And as he passed the row of windows in the hallway, he caught his reflection in the glass, his dark skin, his wide eyes filled with something too raw to name, and he hated that he looked like he wanted to cry, hated the way his mouth quivered even as he clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay silent, to stay strong, just like his mother told him to, but the silence was too much, too heavy, too suffocating, and then a voice called out to him, sharp but gentle, like someone noticing a wound. "Hey, young man, are you all right?" And he turned to see a woman standing just a few feet away, neatly dressed, holding a clipboard, her eyes scanning his face with concern. She was the school principal, Mrs. Harrington, and Gustavo didn't know what to say, just stood there staring, until she walked up closer and said, "You look upset. What happened?" And he looked at her, searching her face for some trace of the same cruelty he'd just seen in Mrs. Carmichael, but there was none, only surprise and worry, and he said, his voice hoarse and broken, "My teacher kicked me out," and she tilted her head slightly confused. "Kicked you out? Why? What did you do?" And he hesitated, looked down at his shoes, then back up at her, and for a moment he didn't want to say it, didn't want to open that wound again, but something inside him said he had to. That silence was part of the pain, so he said it, barely above a whisper. She said, She said, "I don't belong here because I'm black." And the words hung in the air like smoke, and Mrs. Harrington's face changed instantly, her brows furrowing, her eyes widening, as if she couldn't believe what she'd just heard. And she said what? And Gustavo repeated it, stronger this time. She told me to leave the class because I'm black. And the principal was quiet for a second, just a second. And then she drew a deep breath, her voice calm but firm. "Come with me." And they walked together through the halls, Gustavo beside her like a soldier beside a general. And when they reached room 207, Mrs. Harrington didn't hesitate. She opened the door and stepped inside with Gustavo close behind, and the class turned their heads startled. The silence crashing down again as everyone waited to see what would happen next. And Mrs. Carmichael looked up, clearly caught off guard, her eyes darting between Gustavo and the principal. And for a second, she tried to compose herself, tried to slip back into that mask of authority. But Mrs. Harrington spoke first, her voice like a whip in the quiet room. "Mrs. Carmichael, may I have a word?" And the teacher blinked, clearly flustered. "Principal Harrington, I." But the principal raised her hand, cutting her off. "Outside." Now, they stepped into the hallway, leaving the door open just enough for Gustavo and the rest of the class to hear muffled words exchanged in increasingly tense tones. And then after a few moments, the principal stepped back in, her face unreadable, and she looked at Gustavo and said, "Can you wait for me in my office? It's just down the hall, the door with the gold plaque." And he nodded, and she gave him a small reassuring nod before turning back to the teacher, who was now pale and fidgeting with her necklace. And as Gustavo walked away, he could still hear Mrs. Carmichael's voice rising in protest. "It was taken out of context. I didn't mean it like that. He misunderstood me." But the principal didn't seem to be buying any of it, and by the time Gustavo reached the office and sat down in the cushioned chair outside the door, his heart was still pounding. But now it beat with something new, not just fear, not just sadness, but a spark of hope, the feeling that maybe, just maybe, someone had finally listened. Mrs. Harrington stood in the hallway outside her office, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her lips pressed into a hard, thin line as she processed what she had just heard from Gustavo. And though her expression remained composed, there was a storm brewing behind her eyes, a mixture of anger, disbelief, and disappointment. And as she turned and looked at the boy sitting in the chair beside her door, his hands folded in his lap, his face pale but calm, she made a decision right there, one that would not be delayed, not be hidden behind bureaucracy or polite reprimands. And she said, "Come with me," her voice calm but firm, and Gustavo stood, unsure of what would happen next. But there was something in the way she moved with purpose, with justice in every step, that made him trust her, even if only a little. And together they walked back down the hallway, the sounds of distant chatter and footsteps fading as they approached room 207. And when Mrs. Harrington pushed open the door, the room went silent once more, all eyes on the two of them as they entered. And Mrs. Carmichael looked up from her desk, her mouth parting slightly in surprise when she saw the principal standing there beside the boy she had so publicly humiliated just moments earlier. And her face changed, just for a moment. Something flickered across her expression, something uncertain, something that might have been guilt, or perhaps fear, and she started to speak, her voice trembling with sudden meekness. "Principal Harrington, I didn't realize," but Mrs. Harrington raised one hand sharply, and the classroom held its collective breath as the principal stepped forward, her tone measured and cold. "Gustavo has informed me that you removed him from your classroom and told him it was because of the color of his skin." And Mrs. Carmichael's eyes darted to the students, some of whom were staring at her with open confusion, others with silent judgment, and she shook her head quickly. That's not what happened. He must have misunderstood me. I was trying to enforce classroom structure. But Gustavo, standing near the door, didn't flinch, didn't shy away, and simply said, "You said I didn't belong here because I'm black." And for a second, the words rang in the air again, heavy and undeniable, and the other students looked at each other, their silence no longer just compliance but discomfort. And Mrs. Carmichael stepped forward, her hands raised slightly, her voice wobbling with desperation. "I'm sorry, I wasn't thinking, it was a mistake. Please, you have to believe me." "I didn't mean," but Mrs. Harrington cut her off, her voice firm and final. "You don't get to apologize when it's convenient. You are a teacher, a leader, and your words have consequences." And then she turned to the students, who sat frozen in their seats. "You are all witnesses. You heard what was said. And let this be clear, this school does not tolerate racism. Not in whispers, not in jokes, and certainly not from the people we entrust to educate our children." And then she turned back to Mrs. Carmichael, whose face had gone ashen, her mouth still half open, as if she wanted to argue, but knew there was nothing she could say. And Mrs. Harrington continued, "You are relieved of your duties effective immediately. Gather your belongings and leave the premises. HR will be in contact by the end of the day." And the classroom erupted in a quiet storm of shocked gasps and murmurs, and Mrs. Carmichael just stood there, stunned, and then she whispered, "Please." But it was too late. The damage was done, and Mrs. Harrington gestured toward the door. "Now." And the teacher, her composure unraveling, turned and began to pack her things. And Gustavo watched as she moved like someone in a dream, slow and hesitant, as if she couldn't believe this was really happening. And as she walked past him, her eyes briefly met his. But he looked away, not out of fear, but because he didn't need to see her expression anymore. He had already seen who she was, and there was nothing more to understand. And when she was gone, Mrs. Harrington looked at the class again and said, "If any of you ever feel unsafe, disrespected, or unheard, my door is always open." And with that, she turned to Gustavo and said, "Come on. Let's find you a better place to start your first day." And they walked down the hall again. But this time it felt different. Not like a walk of shame, but a walk toward something better. And later that day, Gustavo was assigned a new homeroom, a new teacher named Mr. Jennings, who greeted him with a warm smile and a handshake and introduced him to the class like he was already part of the family. And as the days passed, Gustavo slowly began to settle in, and the whispers about what had happened faded into the background, replaced by laughter in the lunchroom, quiet jokes exchanged over homework, high fives in the hallways, and group projects that turned into real friendships. And though the memory of that first day still lingered like a scar, it no longer defined him, because the people around him began to see him not as the new kid, not as the boy who was kicked out, and not as the black student singled out by a hateful teacher, but simply as Gustavo, the kid who was smart, thoughtful, funny, and brave. And he found himself waking up each morning with less fear in his chest, more confidence in his steps. And when his mom asked him one evening over dinner, "How was school today?" he smiled, really smiled, and said, "It was good," and he meant it. And in time, he would become one of the most respected students in his grade, not because of that one terrible incident, but because of how he carried himself afterward, with quiet strength and kindness. And by the end of the year, he had more friends than he could count, teachers who genuinely supported him, and a future that finally felt like it belonged to him. And he knew, deep down, that he had made it through not just because someone believed him, but because he believed in himself, and that would carry him through whatever came next.